And we're live.
Welcome to the fabulous room 1065. It's the Kelvin Dueck Science Show Extravaganza. And we're live.
Mr. Roth is
No.
He's back later on this week. You ready?
Let's go.
We're looking at changes in ecosystems. Ecosystems change over time. And I already have a short little video to show you. So we have something that we call natural selection. That's what can go in this word here. And this, Nicole, is the process by which species adapt to environmental changes. And it takes a long time. So you have a situation where you have a parent and it has an offspring, but just like you are all slightly different from your parents, the offspring is slightly different from the parents, and there may be a genetic mutation that creates some variation. Some of the mutations may be unhelpful, and so that particular branch of the offspring might not be as adapted to survive in the ecosystem. Some of the mutations may be helpful, and so they tend to pass on their mutation because it's more likely that they're going to survive long enough to reproduce. So we have competition for food and space is the driving force behind natural selection. Stay with the notes and worry about the homework later. The best adapted members of a species are more likely to, and here are the key things for any life form, they want to survive and they want to reproduce. Stay alive and have descendants. I wrote down see natural selection poster. I got a couple for you. So we have something that we call adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is the change from a common ancestor to a number of different species. This is part of Darwin's theory of evolution. We believe that there were species, as they mutate, as they change, they branch off, they fork off. For example, we believe that as human beings, we are all members of the primate family, along with, in fact, we consider ourselves part of the great ape family, along with gorillas, orangutans, and chimpanzees. Why? Well, our DNA and our genes are very, very, very similar. Our physical bodies are very, very, very similar. We believe that there was some kind of common ancestor somewhere up there in the ancestry. Great, great, great Hezekiah Dueck, or somewhere up there in the ancestry. This occurs because of competition for food and space, and the new species occupy different ecological niches. They find somewhere else for them to fit in. If they can't, Hayden, they die off. Well, if they can, survive and reproduce. A great example is the Galapagos Islands. How many of you have heard of the Galapagos Islands before? Where are they? Okay, they're off the coast of Ecuador. What does the word Ecuador mean in Spanish? So they're near the equator off the coast of South America. They were very isolated islands, and so species had a chance to evolve dramatic differences without other species influencing them. When Darwin visited there, this is what really started to crystallize his thinking regarding evolution. In particular, next term. Ecological succession. These are the changes that take place in the types of plants and animals in a particular setting over time. As time passes, Curtis, the plants and animals living in an area can change, and we divide them into two main types. We talk about primary succession. And what do you think the second type of succession is called? Secondary, Captain Obvious. Very good. What's primary succession? Dylan, we start with primary succession when there is nothing but bare rock. Where no soil exists. If there is no soil and only rock, can anything grow? You'd think not, but this is where primary succession starts to begin. First of all, we get this situation after a blank eruption, volcanic eruption. We also get it after a retreat of glaciers, because glaciers scrape the earth clear of everything but rock. Whoever's phone that is can power it off.
Put it in this thing. Oh, no, you know what? I want 10 bits out of that.
No, it's on vibrate. I live with that. Don't like it, but I live with it. The first, if there is rock, there is one type of life form that can actually live off of rock, and they are called lichens, not lichens, lichens, Lichens. Their spores are carried there by water and wind, and they can attach onto rock. In fact, you see them growing on solid rock here in BC all over the place if you go hiking. And they break down the rock, and they do that, they form a very, very thin layer of soil. You may have seen that. That's that very, very thin, almost looks like cobwebby almost vegetation on rocks that you see where the rock is bare. It's often the one that grows around here is kind of a silvery gray color, almost a green but not quite. What else grows on rocks? Moss is the next one. It uses that thin soil layer that the lichen has created. It comes along and it can survive. Oh, and it breaks down the rocks as well, and it adds to the soil, and when it decays, then its nutrients also become part of the soil. Takes a while. Hundreds of years or more. This happens not over your lifetime. This happens over several lifetimes, or several lifetimes. So we have primary succession, and then we have a name for the first species, the first life forms that do show up. We call them pioneer species. This is the first species to live in a particular area. And those species then alter the condition to allow other species to survive in the ecosystem, which then alter conditions even further to allow more species to evolve and survive. The pioneer species, Josh, are usually adapted to grow in harsh, nutrient-poor conditions. So what they do is they help create more soil, and then they add organic matter to the soil when they die and decay. They do two things, Dylan. They make soil more fertile, and they help the soil keep water. It keeps the soil damper, moister, because the roots help trap water. Thank you. They provide food for insects and other animals. And now you've got the beginnings of an ecosystem. You'll have the beginnings of multiple trophic levels. You'll have the beginnings of life. I wrote here, see page 112, 113 for a nice timeline. You can look at that later if you want to. Eventually, the area evolves and alters to form a mature community where you have or just fell, Mr. Dueck. Community. Where you have predators, prey, you have numerous food chains and food webs. you have an ecosystem that's stable and can survive. But these ecosystems slowly change over time. Each community alters the biotic living and abiotic non-living components so the next community can exist. Eventually, a mature, or the fancy word, a climax community develops. You've reached the goal. Everything now is stable. You get a biome. Example, boreal forests, tropical rainforests, grasslands, etc. What does this mean? Kenzie, this means that mature ecosystems actually tend to have fewer species, not more, because the tree cover is more dense. Because the tree cover is more dense, that resulting in less light on the forest floor, and therefore fewer species of plants and animals can grow down there. So that's pioneer succession. Start with rock, start with lichens, get moss, and then you get more stuff. And then the rest of the animals, well, it depends on what biome you're part of. Jake, if you're up north, it's going to be different than if you're along the equator. What was the other succession? Secondary. This occurs faster than primary succession. And it usually occurs after some kind of a disaster. Something has wiped out the vast majority of the life in an area. Flooding, volcanoes. Oh, I already got volcanoes on here, sorry. Drought. That's becoming a big one recently. Tsunamis. Forest fires. Insect infestations. By the way, remember about 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, I showed you that video about the cicadas? They've just started coming out east. People are going crazy. They've just started coming out of their burrows. So for the next 2 or 3 weeks, watch the news and you'll see people. They're everywhere. A couple of chefs are trying to show that they're actually quite edible if you think about them the right way, for what it's worth. In New York, they're serving them in restaurants. Volcanic eruptions. So what happens? Well, because after a disaster, Kenzie, the soil is already in place, that first step of the lichens and the moss having to break down rocks doesn't have to take place. That shortens the time frame quite a bit. Also, there are already microorganisms and seeds, so recovery is much faster. Only decades, or sometimes even only years. A good example being Mount St. Helens, which erupted about 40 years ago. And if you go there now, there's trees and there's forests and there's life there. But 30 years ago, 10 years after the eruption, it was still pretty barren. You were just getting some small green grass and things like that. What are some causes of secondary succession? Forest or grassland fires? Those seem like disasters, but we have learned over the past 30 years, Amy, that these are actually natural, and in fact, they're beneficial. Many organisms have adapted to regular forest fires every 4 or 5 years. And because our policy is to stop all forest fires, and we've done that for about the past 100 years, we've really changed here in North America our local forests. So, grass roots extend sometimes as much as 3 meters into the soil. If the grassland burns over the top of them, the roots still survive, Hayden. Also, you have thick bark on mature trees. Many trees can survive a forest fire. Not small ones, but mature ones can. Seeds often survive. In fact, there are some species of seeds that need a forest fire before they'll open up. There are some species of seeds that will be dormant until they're exposed to the heat of a fire, and then after they cool off, they sprout. Those seeds have learned, oh, a bunch of trees have just turned to ash. That ash is nutrient rich. It's going to mix in the soil. Now's a good time to grow. Some animals survive by burrowing into the ground or hiding in lakes. Fires help with recycling nutrients. So Jenny, what we started to do in the past 30 years or so, we've actually started to do controlled forest fire burns and controlled grassland burns. Oh yeah, turn the page. Flooding. Flooding occurs along coastal areas, if it's ocean flooding, like from Hurricane Katrina, or it occurs along lakes and rivers. When can flooding occur? Well, one way it can occur is due to rapid blank melt. What goes in the blank? Snow? Yep. If you have a big snowpack, and then suddenly you have some unexpectedly hot weather, it all melts at once. We deal with that here in our area every so often. It can also occur due to heavy rains or storms and tsunamis. It results in soil erosion, soil pollution because it brings in toxic chemicals or it washes out toxic chemicals from where they've been stored, and disease via the sewage that it washes around from both humans and animals, the waste products. Tsunamis, we've talked about those. We watched a video about that. A huge, rapidly moving ocean wave caused by earthquakes, or it can also be caused by an underwater volcanic eruption. And it destroys organisms in its path. And the other problem is tsunamis aren't freshwater. What kind of water are they? Salt water, and so even when it leaves, it may have left the salt behind, so it can increase the soil, the fancy word for salt, salinity. And you saw from the video that we watched, it can cause massive destruction. Drought. This is a below average amount of precipitation. Crop failure, death of animals. Hey, life needs water to survive. Unless you're adapted for life in the desert, if suddenly your life becomes a desert, you're going to be in trouble. Here's the concern. Well, you guys watch the news. I wrote here, the frequency of drought seems to be the same, increasing, or decreasing. What have you noticed in the news if you watch the news? Yeah, it seems to be going up. It's a small sample. It's a small time sample, only about the past 20 years. But if it is increasing, it could eventually affect us. We're lucky we have lots of water, justice for now. Insect infestations. We're dealing with one here in BC, the mountain pine beetle. So the mountain pine beetle destroys only older, read the wrong word. Geez, Dueck. Older, weaker pine trees. Which is part of the cycle of life, Amber. No big deal. In fact, the younger trees defend themselves by producing a sap called resin, R-E-S-I-N. And it's thick enough and it's sticky enough that the pine beetles really don't deal with it all that well. They'll go eat on a tree that's drier and older. It's a natural part of the ecosystem. It allows nutrient cycling, remember the carbon cycle, the phosphorus cycle, the nitrogen cycle. And it creates space for new young trees to grow. However, lately, we have too many beetles. So they are attacking younger trees too. Killing forests. If you Google mountain pine beetle, British Columbia, and you click on images, you'll see satellite photos or airborne photos of entire forests that aren't green, they're red, because they're all dead. Also, forest fire prevention results in older trees that would have burned down, Sarah, because they didn't have the thick bark yet. Well, we've let them grow up because we thought we needed to prevent all forest fires. Seemed like a good idea. What did we say that the beetles preferred? Young trees or older trees? So if there's more food, what will happen to the population of the beetles? It's a predator-prey, so more beetles. Even that wouldn't be too big an issue, because normally cold winters kill the beetles. In the interior, if you have about 3 weeks where it's minus 20 or below, it takes care of almost all of them. What have we noticed about the temperature the past 15 or 20 years on our planet? Not getting as cold, at least not in our area. So not blank enough, not cold enough lately. So if you have a whole bunch of more beetles than normal, even if you're a young, healthy tree, if too many beetles attack or if the tree is stressed, it can't produce enough resin, and so the beetles also kill younger trees. Continuing on with section 3.2. How humans influence ecosystems. Okay. Again, mostly terminology, and again, a lot of what I just taught you in 3.1, you've seen before, you watched the news, you've read about it, and this is going to be fairly similar. So we have some terminology here. The first word we have for you is the word sustainability. Sustainability is the ability of an ecosystem to sustain ecological processes for the future while still providing economic opportunities for the people. We are trying to find ways to both make money, make food, eat food, live our lifestyle, but do so in such a way so that 2 or 3 generations from now, they're not having to go live in the caves again. We haven't been doing a great job of it, but we're getting better. And that's going to be your main challenge, I suspect, as adults. For example, wetland bogs, of which we have some great ones, are used for blueberry and cranberry farming. In particular, cranberries are harvested by flooding a field. Well, hey, if it's a bog already, it has no problem being flooded, or less of a problem being flooded. Psst. And I wrote see page 123 if you want to see a picture of them doing it. So what are the effects of land and resource use through history and currently? Throughout history, we as human beings have used the land and its resources to meet our needs. And 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, when our populations were very, very small, we did not have that big an impact. We're having a pretty big impact now. So human expansion into ecosystems can destroy or fragment ecosystems if we're not very careful. So a couple of terminologies. Habitat loss is the destruction of habitats. habitat fragmentation is dividing it into parts that are no longer connected. For example, as we expand our cities, as we build subdivisions, often we'll build a subdivision kind of out in the middle of nowhere. Well, we've just set up a split. We fragmented that particular habitat, and that will have an impact. Maybe not a big one, maybe we can live with it, but if we add more and more subdivisions, we've got to be careful, we've got to be aware. Wetlands. Wetlands are ecosystems where the soil is waterlogged for all or part of the year. In fact, we call them the kidneys of the earth. The same way your kidneys filter out from your food and your beverages all of the products that are unhealthy for you, wetlands do the same thing for the planet. If you ever walk through a swamp, what does the water look like in the swamp itself? Wonderfully clear and blue and drinkable? No. Why? It's filtering out a lot of the toxins, but you go 10 or 15 kilometers down water of that swamp and you'll see, oh, it's pulled out most of it. In fact, we do the same thing with our filters that we use in our water. We use charcoal, we use some combination of basically an artificial wetland to do it for us. So they help prevent flooding. They absorb water before it goes places that it shouldn't. They also absorb good old CO2. However, they are being drained. It's very, very easy to not care about a swamp. If it's a pretty forest with trees, you might get a little more upset. Ah, swamp, who walks over there? So we're turning them into parking lots, malls, etc. Put your pencils down, look up. Next page. Deforestation. We don't live in trees anymore. If we want to live somewhere, we tend to remove most of or all of the trees. So deforestation, this is when forests are logged or cleared and in the old days never replanted. We're better at it now, but you'll still see on mountains if you travel in interior BC or along the coast or even in our area, huge sections of bare mountain. It was clear cut and not replanted. What does this mean? Well, it leads to soil degradation, that should be a T. The soil is nowhere near as good because there's not trees that will then rot and die and send their nutrients back into the soil. Oh, and soil erosion, because Kenzie, when it rains, the trees stop the water from pushing everything down the mountainside. Well, if they're not there, the soil is just going to run down the mountainside. It leads to good gosh, my spelling is bad today. Biodiversity loss. Fewer species. Also leads to habitat loss. And there in brackets, there's the definition of biodiversity. Decreased number of species. What else do we do? Well, we plant stuff and farm stuff, livestock and crops. So what does that do? Well, one of the things that happens is a process called soil compaction. The soil gets compacted, gets pressed down from farm machinery and from animals. If you've ever seen where a herd of cows has been grazing for several months and you go walk on that field, you'll notice there are portions of it that are very, very hard compared to other portions of it. The animals, their mass, has simply compacted the soil. And what does that do? Well, when the soil particles are squeezed together, can be caused by farm machinery, tractors, or by grazing animals. This increases erosion. When soil is not compacted, there's lots of gaps between chunks of soil. Hey, water can flow in there easily. When it's compacted, the water can't sink into the soil. It's going to run all over the top of the soil, pulling soil with it, washing it away. In fact, we do something to our lawns, we do something to fields to add little holes. We call it, you know the term? What's the term, Brad? Aeration. Make sure I spell it right since my spelling is terrible today. When we had an actual field back here instead of the current field, and I think still they do it over on the grass field over there, you'll see every so often that weird looking machinery tractor comes along and pulls up a bunch of little tiny pieces, plugs of grass. It's aerating the soil. Because you guys have compacted it. You're not grazing animals, but you're running all over that field. You're compacting the soil. We also have resource exploitation. This is the use of resources such as fish, timber, minerals, gold, copper, etc., fossil fuels. What are the problems? Well, first thing that we often do when we're mining is contamination. We introduce harmful chemicals, toxins, or waste into the environment. When we're mining, for example, it's not like you suddenly find, say you're mining for silver, oh, here's an entire underground room full of nothing but silver. You're taking in rock of all sorts of types, and you have to separate the silver from all the other types of rocks. How do they do it? Some kind of chemical reaction. Oh, but then you have this toxic sludge left over of stuff you don't want. Now, you'll probably, if you're a good company, try and remove other stuff from there that you might want. But eventually, Sarah, you end up with this sludge that has no materials that you want. What you going to do with it? Dump it. Okay, we tend, Jessica, to store it now. But even storing it is tricky because those containers leak. Also, over-exploitation. Come on, get the I in there. Over-exploitation. If you use too heavy of a resource, it can result in extinction. Hey, we used up all the water in the area for human beings. The animals die off. Hey, we used up all the trees in an area to build houses. Nowhere for nests for birds. I can still remember when I was about 16, we moved into a brand new subdivision in Abbotsford. But whoever had built the subdivision had removed all of the trees, every single tree, for miles in this subdivision. And I can still remember it was about 3 years before you heard any birds. Because all the landscapers had planted artificial trees, like planted trees, but it took a while for the birds to figure out they could come back. It was weird. You missed it. Thankfully, they don't do that so much anymore. For example, a famous extinction case is the passenger pigeon, which was shot for food and for fun. In the 1920s, less than 100 years ago, passenger pigeon flocks would literally fly over cities for 3 or 4 days non-stop. Yes, you got pooed on quite a bit. They were these huge flocks of birds that would take days and days to go over you. That took us about 15 years. We killed them all off. Well done. We almost killed off all the buffalo that used to live everywhere. And we're still doing stuff like this. For example, we don't know how to fish properly. Atlantic cod has decreased by 90%. We almost made the whales extinct. At least most countries have stopped that. They're bouncing back. You know what? It's easy to sell somebody on protecting a whale because when you see a whale either in an aquarium or live, that's fairly inspirational, Hayden. Your heart kind of goes pitter-pat. You know what? You might say emotionally, yeah, I want to save the whales. It's a little harder to get uptight about a codfish when there's millions of them. Well, there's not anymore. So how does this impact? We're nearly done. It should be done in about 5 minutes. Well, first of all, here's an example. Here's our word again, overexploitation. Overexploitation. back 80 and 90 years ago, we were killing sperm whales and baleen whales like crazy. In 1946, we overhunted them. This meant there was a shortage. What that meant was the orcas, what we call the killer whales, the orcas that normally fed on those whales had to find something else to eat because they're hungry. So they started eating seals and sea otters and salmon. Well, the low numbers of sea otters resulted in a huge increase in sea urchins, because sea otters eat sea urchins. Sea urchins have profligated dramatically. There's way more of them. They eat kelp forests, sometimes destroying them completely. In fact, they can take 45% of a kelp forest in one day sometimes. They are voracious little eaters. Little video for you. So what we've had to do is we've had to look at how resources have been managed for thousands of years by indigenous peoples. We've had to put aside our Western, hey, we can solve everything with technology, and say, maybe the people that were here before us might have known what they're doing, even though they didn't have computers. Maybe there is something we can learn from them. So we gain valuable data about local climate and resources, plant and animal life cycles. And in the old days, information was passed down from generation to generation, orally. And the indigenous peoples probably, Ty, did a better job than us of managing their ecosystems. As an example, the Cree burning, they would burn prairie fires in northern Alberta. This was an early form of management. They would light artificial grass fires. After the grass burned, the nutrients would then be back into the soil. They would rotate them. We're cluing in that, maybe nature knew what it was doing better than us. So we've slowly shifted our philosophy from, good try. Suppressing all forest fires to creating controlled burns, and you can get more information on that on page 134. You have been very patient with me. What's your homework? I have 2 little handouts. I think each of them is 1 page. One short one for each lesson.